All right, good afternoon, good morning to everyone here, wherever you may be. It's great to have a lot of you guys here on with us. Appreciate you taking some time here to be with us as we talk about, yet again, the new four-umpire system on the 60-foot diamond here that was released here earlier this spring in 2021. Today, we kind of go back to like the whole part whole conversation. Remember, we started with the whole, looking at the basic rotations that make up the four-umpire system, the full and the fill rotations that we kind of labeled. And then from there, we went ahead and broke it down to some of the more general responsibilities, tracking and tracing fly balls. And then today we'll go back to the whole, but also kind of in that part by looking at what exactly is done by U1 and U3, the wing umpires here, what's required of them in this new four umpire system. Now, we'll introduce a lot of concepts that we've kind of sprinkled in the last couple weeks. And one of those concepts is point of base. And point of base is a concept here that will help us start to envision how to get to the wedge at a lot of these tag plays today for at first and third base. And if you're somebody that is interested in some more stuff of the wedge, our purpose today is not necessarily to teach the wedge for its usage on the bases. There's a couple of video handouts that we've got that go along and give some great descriptions of those. We've just kind of borrowed some footage from Will Little, a Major League Baseball umpire who does a really fantastic job of outlining that. And that is then available for you in the chat. DJ will go ahead and get that linked at some point here today. But if you're somebody here as we talk about point of base that wonders how that gets us into the wedge, yes, we'll talk about that today. And if you're looking for some more instruction over the wedge, that's not necessarily our scope today, but rather those videos that DJ will link here in the chat and then I'll put in the description on YouTube can help you go ahead and think about putting the wedge in practice from point of base at both first and third. So that's our point of focus here for us today. Now, before I get into an overview here, even more so of what we're getting ready to do, just an issue of congratulations in terms of big announcement. DJ became a father, yet again, I guess you could say. This Wednesday, he had a little beautiful girl, Scarlett Stella Joe is her name, Scarlett Stella Joe. So I'm glad to have DJ on with us here today. But again, congratulations to him and his family as they added a third daughter to the mix there. So DJ, congratulations. Other than that, anybody have any announcements, anything to add here before we get started here with content for us today?
All good.
All righty, let's go ahead and get rolling then. So our scope today is to take a look then at the job of both U1 and U3 in the four umpire system on the 60-foot diamond. So to do that, we'll kind of break that down into a couple different categories. First of all, we'll review some of the things that we've covered in the last 3 episodes here so far in this season. And then we'll also start to take a look at the job U1 and U3 have to do on balls on the infield, what dictates their initial starting position. We'll take a look at routine balls that don't require them to rotate and the usage of point of bag. And we'll also talk about how to handle steal plays and back picks there as well. Now, again, we'll definitely mention the wedge here too and kind of talk a little bit about it. And it's not a wedge instructional video. Again, those will be available for you in the chat here as we get going through things today. But nonetheless here, we will talk about point of base, which is kind of the precursor. And that's the win that we want, is getting us to point of base here for a lot of those routine balls to the outfield and then ultimately getting set up for tag plays, whether they be from the outfield or ultimately from the catcher or wherever the case may be on steal plays and back picks and things like that. So that is our scope here for us today. I'm going to go ahead and get my screen all shared up here for us. So give me a chance here to go ahead and get back to the right web page. And then we'll go ahead and get started with things here today. Again, all about U1 and U3. We'll take U2 in a separate conversation then next week. That'll be our next episode here. So next week we'll be all on U2. There's a lot more that goes into working as the second base umpire. So we'll go ahead and take a look at that in its own episode, actually the finale then next week here as we go ahead and turn the calendar to July. But nonetheless, focus of today then is as U1 and U3 here as in the four umpire system on the 60-foot diamond. Now, before we kind of get started here with a couple different things here with regards to things, number one, what I want to do is review a little bit about the general responsibilities of U1. First off and foremost, remember that U1 is responsible for fair foul from the front edge of the base and beyond. In episodes past, we talked about that pane of glass at that front edge, and if it cracks it, it belongs then to the base umpire. And remember, we want to see the base umpire on the line, not next to the line, but on the line for fair foul decisions there. Remember the area responsibility for catch, no catch, anything that requires the right fielder to move in any direction towards the line. We talked about tracking and chasing fly balls last week. And then in our first episode of the series, we talked about the 2 rotations, the full rotation, which requires U1 to handle everything at first base on the batter runner or R1, and then rotate aggressively to home plate. Remember, they're going to rotate in foul territory, get to point of plate, and then adjust with the play using the wedge at the plate as well. And then the other rotation, the fill rotation, then U1 really has no other responsibilities then other than moving towards point of base. And we'll talk more about movement to point of base and what exactly that looks like here in some video examples as well. So that's kind of just a general overview or reminders here of what the responsibilities of U1 are here in the general responsibilities on the 4-umpire system on the 60-foot diamond. Now, the first kind of category for us to look at is finding an initial starting position. And again, remember, we talked about a lot of these guiding principles earlier on in the season. So just to kind of refresh our memory here, when we're selecting an initial starting position, a pre-pitch initial starting position, we got to find a place, a spot that allows us to do three things. Number one, it's going to afford freedom of movement for the fielders, meaning that we're not going to be in the way of any of these fielders. Okay, so that's the first thing, affording freedom of movement for fielders. Secondly, anything that allows us, or a place in that allows us to arrive on time. So that means here then that we are going to be able to either rotate and be where we need to be on time, or we're going to be able then to get to our base or any play at that base on time as well. So we need to have an initial starting position pre-pitch that's not too deep, where we can't afford freedom of movement and we can't get to where we want to be in position on time, and obviously a spot that we want to be in the best position possible. So as we're thinking about where exactly to stand, depth, positioning, and things like that, those are kind of the three guiding principles for us to consider. One that affords freedom of movement, allows you to rotate on time or arrive on time, and then lastly, to get to the best position possible for any developing play there at the base. So with that being said here, we kind of want to talk about U1's initial starting position. And I shouldn't say almost, it is always going to see U1 start in the A position. We want to see U1 square to the plate, right foot in foul territory, as you see there, both feet technically here as we see in foul territory, not touching the line, but completely in foul territory for our initial starting position. Now, one thing here to consider is our depth. And the last three bullet points here are kind of some big things to highlight when we're selecting our depth. When the first baseman, or F3, is playing at a normal position, when we typically see him or her play, we want to see ourselves 10 to 12 feet behind the first baseman, 10 to 12 feet behind the first baseman. Now again, 10 to 12 feet isn't necessarily all that much, so we're kind of shortening up. Realistically, 10 to 12 feet is about 4 steps, about 4 strides. So we want to see you shorten up again to, number one, afford freedom of movement of the fielder. Secondly, be able to get in a position. And then thirdly, obviously get to a spot on time. So again, that's that 10 to 12 feet when the first baseman, F3, is playing in a normal position. If F3 moves up, so too are we. But never are we going to get closer than that 10 to 12 foot range from the base. So we'll never see a first base umpire. We should never see a first base umpire position then any closer than 10 to 12 feet from the base. And always then we should see that first base umpire position behind the first baseman. Again, notice here that our initial starting position may change based upon the position that the first baseman is electing to play. If he or she's in a normal position, we are playing then that 10 to 12 feet off the first baseman. If the fielder moves up, so too will we, but never closer than 10 to 12 feet. And then what happens if the first baseman moves back? Well, we're not necessarily going to move further back to maintain that 10 to 12 feet distance. We're actually going to reduce the distance as you see here. So if the first baseman moves back, we just want to see ourselves reduce that distance between us, the umpire, and the first baseman, but still remain 1 or 2 steps, because remember, affording freedom of movement of the fielder is still one of the number one priorities, one of the priorities for us to consider here in selecting an initial starting position. So a couple things to make sure that we have here. Again, we're in foul territory, both feet in foul territory, adjacent to the line, but still really close to the line so that we can get on the line should we have fair foul. Again, and then you've got that 10 to 12 foot range based upon the depth that the first baseman plays. Any questions on initial starting position or anything like that here? We want to make sure that we kind of understand the importance of shortening up to allow us to get to where we need to be and still afford freedom of movement. Any questions there? All right. Let's go ahead and talk a little bit about a couple different other concepts here. I think the first of which then is how exactly we're going to see these umpires or from U1 handle infield ground balls. And it's really no different than anything that we would have probably seen prior to this point. Remember that when we work first base, anytime we have an infield ground ball, we want to see that umpire get their 90-degree angle with the throw. Here, this umpire does a great job with this throw from the shortstop of getting that 90-degree angle. Remember, get your eyes ahead of the throw. If you've ever felt a play blow up on you, or you've heard somebody use that phrase, the play blew up on me, that probably means that their eyes did not get ahead of the throw in time. So yes, we want to see the ball fielded, but get your eyes ahead of the ball, ahead of the throw here, and fixated at first base. That way the play does not blow up on you. And again, we want to get our 90-degree angle with the throw. Here's one to second base. Our first base umpire kind of probably comes in a little bit more obtuse than we should see, but nonetheless here, we kind of get the point. We should be working to find a 90-degree angle with an infield ground ball. Now, as U1 here, a lot of times people ask, when can we take plays, force plays at first base in foul territory? Really, we kind of want to save those just for the most part for 9-3 or even potentially 8-3 putouts. So balls coming to us from the outfield. If that ball's on the infield, we want to try and take these as much as we can in fair territory just to make sure that we've got the best look possible and that we don't have to potentially be in the way of the batter runner's overrun into the base or any fielder's overrun over through the base too, and allow us to make sure that we can see, in this case, in foot race and run and roll plays, which foot actually hits the base before the other to make our appropriate ruling. So again, we want to take as many force plays at first base as U1 in fair territory. And that's kind of the purpose here. Whether they be run and roll plays or foot race plays, we still would like to see U1 as much as possible take these in fair territory. Again, you'll see this one in the freeze frame because that's going to give us kind of that wedge look, I guess you could say, to determine for the best without an obstructed view as to whose foot then is going to touch the base first. And again, really the only force plays we would want to see our first base umpire take at first base from foul territory would be putouts from the outfield, 8-3 or 9-3 in that case, which every now and then happens. Another challenging play here is U1 on the infield is one that's fielded in the imaginary box. The imaginary box just refers to a line that comes to us from the 30-foot line to the mound and then kind of back over to the third base line. If it's fielded in that box, as this one is in here, okay, so if you think about that imaginary line, again, from the 30-foot line to the mound, and then another line, obviously, from about the same point on the third base line to the mound. If it's fielded in that one, remember, our 90-degree angle takes us closer to the baseline between first and second base. Sometimes we can get there and get that 90. Sometimes the play happens way too fast. So we want to say get as far as the play allows you. But nonetheless, our 90 here is kind of more closer towards that baseline between first and second. And again, just to make sure here that we're refreshing our memory as to what exactly the job is of U1 on these infield ground balls. And that's to find our 90. Continue on here to talk a little bit more about the job U1 has to do. And this then happens to be with not just infield ground balls, but ultimately routine fly balls and routine hits to the outfield. Now, things are going to be a little bit different here for U1. And we're going to talk about point of base. And just up on the screen, you can kind of see where point of base is located. There's a couple things to go ahead and point out about point of base. And I'll go ahead and give us the text here. First of all, where is point of base? Well, if you take a look at the graphic, you'll see that point of base is an imaginary line from the inside corner to the outside corner and then straight back. Now, it's important to note that this is a starting position that allows us to stay chest to ball and allows us to use our eyes properly for obstruction potentially at first base, run arounding, make sure he or she touches the base, so on and so forth. So again, we want to get to this spot on any routine hit or routine fly ball to the outfield. This position is about 5 to 8 feet from the first base in foul territory. One thing I would say here about this one, and one thing to think about, is just making sure that we can be in a spot where we may have to box out the base coach at first base. So I would probably suggest starting at least in front of the coach's box. That way, when you move into position, you don't have to go ahead and try and fight the first base coach there. It's a little bit more difficult to win an argument with the first base coach trying to remove him or her from the coach's box. So I would say try and get to this spot that is just right before then the coach's box. Stay in front of the coach's box. That way you don't have to fight that coach necessarily. But nonetheless here, point of base straight from the inside corner of the bag through the outside about 5 to 8 feet then. And again, this allows the umpire to remain chest to ball, prevents us from getting in the way, so it affords freedom of movement. And again, this is just an initial starting position from which we may see the umpire adjust to a potential tag play, whether it be a throw back on the batter runner at first base, or as we'll see here in just a second, when we see then back picks at first base as well. So point of base is where we want to be for any potential tag play, or in this case, as we see here, any routine ball, whether it be on the ground or in the air for U1. Now, a couple things here to think about with regards to point of base. And as I mentioned, point of base is not necessarily the end-all, be-all. It's not an ending position, but it is a starting position from which we can adjust with a developing tag play. So what are the goals then here? And we're going to see the umpires in these clips kind of work for these goals. So from point of base, we will adjust to, number one, get the runner sliding at us. And if you've kind of followed the thought process and the philosophy of the wedge over the last recent years, getting the runner to slide at you is one of the priorities here in getting the best look possible. So from point of base, we kind of move or adjust to make sure we get the runner sliding at us. Secondly, that we adjust to keep our head between the runner and the fielder to put ourselves in the best look possible. And then lastly, we use our eyes properly to get our proper timing. Okay, and again, those all stem from getting to point of base. But again, if you're somebody that hasn't necessarily used the wedge on the bases yet, getting to point of bag is kind of the first moral victory. And then getting to point of bag consistently and working from point of bag consistently will eventually get you then to applying the fundamentals of the wedge position. So getting to point of bag is kind of the first priority here for us. And then worrying about the wedge after that is something that we can kind of think about as we get more reps at moving to point of bag. Let's take a look at a couple of these clips here for us in terms of routine balls to the outfield for U1. Remember, we want to move to point of bag, and here's kind of why. So here we have a routine hit to right field. And let's say this one gets cut off and we throw back to the base on the batter runner, who in this case is advancing to second base. We want to make sure we're in position there. Now, this umpire has kind of over-anticipated a potential play coming back to him at first base. Remember, we kind of want to remain point of bag. As you can see here, if we start to drift a little bit lower, especially below the bag, it gets a little bit more difficult to remain chest to ball. Whereas if we take that inside corner through the outside corner and kind of just hang on there, especially when we have no play, that allows us then to, as we said, remain chest to ball and use our eyes properly. And then as the tag play develops, then we can adjust. Here in this clip, the umpire has kind of adjusted rather than just remaining point of bag because he has no play there. But nonetheless, if there was a play back into first base, we should see the umpire then adjust from point of bag. That's exactly what we're going to see in this clip. So a ground ball up the box into center field. Center fielder fields it. The throw is cut off here by the pitcher. And then as you can see here, the batter runner's kind of hung out to dry. Now, with the batter runner hung out to dry, let's take a look at U1. Remember, we want to see U1 positioned at point of bag, so 5 to 8 feet behind the bag from that front to back side corner. And then as this play develops, we can adjust with it to try and get our head and eyes between the base runner and the fielder. Now, in this case, this umpire is probably a little bit closer than we would like. But again, just want to highlight here the importance of taking a point of bag position that's probably in front of the coach's box. That way, when you adjust with the play, you don't necessarily have to worry about getting any type of, trying to get a look through the first base coach is essentially what I'm trying to say here. So I do think that this umpire may be a little bit close. Toes on the grass line, which is about 3 feet, is probably a good position there too as we adjust and close in on the play. But here we're probably a little bit close. But again, just to highlight the importance of starting point of base that's just slightly in front of the coach's box. That way we don't necessarily get into a shoving match here or a vision match with the third base coach. But again, we want to be at point of bag and adjust with it just in case we get a throw back on the batter runner in that case at first base. Now, the same is kind of true here with back picks at first base. So if we take a look here at back picks, these are basically throws to us from the catcher. So here we have some highlights and things to highlight here. Remember, the depth of our starting position is one of the most important fundamentals for us to use here with these back picks. So our pre-pitch starting position should be relative to the fielder. If you remember or think about baseball in general, anytime first base is occupied, as we see in this clip, oftentimes the first baseman either plays even with the base or will actually play in front of the base. So again, if the fielder's moving up, as we talked about previously, so too should the umpire should move up as well. So the depth of our pre-pitch starting position is really important here with trying to get in position for any back pick back on R1 here in this case, as we'll see. And we'll also want to see the umpire kind of take some post-pitch steps. And what we mean by post-pitch steps is once the catcher catches the ball, we should see the umpire either take 1 or 2 read steps. That way we already have momentum moving forward to allow us to, do whatever things that we need to do in terms of responsibility. Now, we don't have to move all the way into position every single time. We're just using those 1 or 2 post-pitch steps as read steps as to whether or not we should continue to read a back pick or potentially just kind of cut it off and get back to our initial starting position. So again, in order to get position for our back picks, depth of pre-pitch starting position and the intensity and efficiency of our post-pitch steps are really important. Here's a look at the fundamentals of these back picks. Again, we still want to get head and eyes in between the fielder and the runner, kind of from that point of base. So here's the back pick. Catcher throws down to first base. And here we see the work of our umpire. If we kind of take a look at our umpire in kind of a slow motion, he's able to, from his initial starting position, get to a spot where he can get his head and eyes just about in between the tag attempt and the runner from point of base. Good distance there, probably a little bit slower on his timing. And we take a look at him here, he should probably still be hands on knee set. The ball has not yet arrived to the catcher's mitt. Remember, we don't want to take our post-pitch steps until the catcher receives the ball. Then we can take our 1 or 2 post-pitch steps to read the play. But nonetheless, this umpire does a great job of moving into position here for this potential back pick and the out call. Okay, and if you take a look at the view across the diamond, this is what we're looking at here from point of base. Okay, head and eyes in between the runner and the fielder. And that way we can see the best look possible on that tag attempt. Another look at a back pick. I think this umpire does a really good job of getting his head and eyes in between the runner, but again, maybe just a little bit too close here on this play. Okay, but nonetheless, if we take a look at the cross view here that we'll see, this is kind of the angle that we want to see this umpire work to achieve. Sometimes it's possible, sometimes it's not. Just not this close. This umpire should probably be about another 2, maybe 3 steps back off of this one. But remember, being able to get your head and eyes here and get this look is all dependent upon the efficiency of your post-pitch steps, and even more importantly, the depth of your initial starting position. DJ Seth, anything here on U1 to talk about or add or anything like that here, or anything in the chat to go back and reference?
Nothing in the chat. I just want to reiterate I was a guy that used to be really, really deep. Just I don't know if I felt cooler or why. But this year specifically, I focused on initial starting position, starting closer, just off the fielder, and just as somebody who made a personal point of emphasis this year, start closer. Be aware of where your first baseman is, third baseman is. It makes a huge, huge difference. So the initial starting position is critical when it comes to this type of stuff. So just wanted to reiterate that as somebody who focused on that individually this year.
Absolutely. Now, we coupled U1 and U3 together because the principles of both of them are the same. So again, to kind of review just very quickly, U3's fundamentals, remember fair foul from the front edge of the base, talked about painted glass. Remember, when we have a fair foul decision, make sure we are on the line. Okay, make sure we're on the line for that, not necessarily next to it. Area of responsibility, F7 to the line. That would belong then to U3. Talked about tracking and chasing earlier. In the season, full rotation and work on the pivot. Remember, we talked about that into the working area here. And then in the field rotation, they're going to make a little bit more of a deeper pivot into the working area simply because U3 would be responsible for plays at both second and third base. Now, very similar, the starting position for U3, if you take the fundamentals that we talked about over as U1 and just apply them to the other side of the diamond, you got exactly what you're looking for. So U3 is always going to start, in this case, in the D position, both feet in foul territory, square to the plate here. And again, that 10 to 12 foot distance is what we're looking for off the fielder. Remember, if the fielder, in this case, it's the it's the third baseman. If he or she is at normal depth, then we're going to play that 10 to 12 feet behind the third baseman. But if that third baseman is moving up, just as DJ just mentioned, we want to shorten the distance as well, but never closer than 10 to 12 feet from third base. Remember here that 10 to 12 feet is really only no more than about 4 strides. So kind of keep that in mind here as you're gauging the depth of your pre-pitch starting position to allow you to, number one, provide freedom of movement for the fielder, allow you to get to where you need to be, and then be in position as well. Remember, if F5 moves back, so too are we, but we're not going to be, if F5, for example, is super deep, we're not going to be 10 to 12 feet off of the third baseman in that case, and we can shorten up, reduce distance, as you see in the last bullet point, usually 1 to 2 steps then behind F5. Point of base is very similar here. Again, it's that line straight from the inside of the base through the outside corner, about 5 to 7 feet there. And again, remember, we kind of want to work that area between the base and the coach's box. That way we don't necessarily have to worry about the coach getting in the way potentially of anything or any work that we would have to do at third base. So again, that allows us to remain chest to ball, to see everything, and then adjust with the play. Again, remember, point of base is a starting position. So that's a spot where we can be chest to ball and use our eyes properly. As a tag play goes ahead and develops, we will adjust from there. That's when the wedge comes into play. And again, that wedge handout is available for you in the chat with more about how exactly to use the wedge from point of base. But our focus then here is getting to point of base and then adjusting from there. Now, the other thing to highlight here, and we kind of mentioned this a little bit in first base, but here at third base, going below the bag is kind of like an electric fence that we want to worry about, simply because our angles get relatively difficult. If you remember, our goal here is to get, number one, the runner sliding at you, but secondly, to make sure our head and eyes are between the runner and the fielder. So very rarely, if you go below the base, will your head ever be between the runner and the fielder. So make sure that we kind of avoid going below the bag. Now, there is one situation where going below the bag is okay. We'll see some video of that here in just a second. But for the most part, we want to work to make sure that we avoid going below the bag, both at first base and then even at third base, unless the fundamentals in the play take us there. And we'll take a look at some of those examples here in just a second. Let's first take a look at some of the balls to the infield here. So batted balls on the infield as U3. Here's our first one. We're going to see this umpire, and we're going to want to see U3 move to point of bag here in this case. Here, the situation is R2 only, ground ball to the third baseman. He tries to look the runner back at second base, and then the runner at second base, as a smart base runner, tries to go ahead and advance. So now we get a play back over here, which means that we should see the umpire move to point of base at third base so he can position himself for any developing play. Now, from that position at point of base, we can adjust to make sure that the runner is, number one, sliding at us, and then secondly, our head and eyes are between the runner and the fielder. We take a look at the replay, take a look at the job U3 does. Again, you see here that the third baseman is in front of the base here. In this case, he's actually in the grass. We see a shortened up position here by U3, so a good job of shortening up the position. Still not closer than 10 to 12 feet from the base. And then again, you saw him take some steps down towards the line. He got the point of base, and as he sees the first baseman make this play, he adjusts with it to get his head in between the runner who is sliding into the base and the fielder potentially making the play. Another look here at this example. Okay, so in this position, I think we probably started a little bit too shallow, but nonetheless here, fundamentals are still the same. Ball in the infield, we move to point of base as U3 for any potential play. Here we get into a rundown. And again, this is kind of the only time we should see the umpire move below the bag is when we have a potential play that's going to happen out in front of the base. So here you've got this tag that's going to happen out in front of the base. That's when we can see this umpire start to move down below the base, and then that's how we're going to get a look at that one. If you kind of think about this position from a point of bag, we probably get straight lined if we hold on to point of bag. That's why I say, and that's why we say that point of bag is essentially an initial starting position, and then we adjust with the play from there. And again, the only time we should see the umpire kind of move below the bag is when the tag attempt is going to happen out in fair territory, and therefore we should see the umpire move below the bag and out into fair territory as well. I've got another one of those examples here coming up here for us as well. But nonetheless, infield ground balls move to point of bag here as U3. Another look at this one. This umpire should be on the line, not necessarily next to it here for the fair foul decision. But again, we get to point of bag here in this case. You can kind of see this umpire get there, and then he starts to adjust with the play on this play back into it. Head and eyes in between the fielder and the runner with the runner sliding at you. Okay, so another great look here. Again, this umpire should probably be on the line here for fair foul, not necessarily next to it. And then as we get this play back into it, remember from point of base, we want to adjust with the play to number one, get the runner sliding at us, which is what we've got here. And then secondly, make sure that our head and eyes are going to be between the tag and the runner. Okay, so point of base allows us to get there. And on any infield ground balls, we're going to want to see U3 then move to point of bag and then adjust with the play from there. Now, very similar here, balls to the outfield. Okay, I think that's what we're supposed to get to here next. Balls to the outfield, we're going to move to point of base as well. And again, the fundamentals are going to be the same. I'll kind of let these clips move. So here we have a batted ball, a routine ball to right field. Play is going to happen at third base. We're going to move to point of base, use chest the ball and our eyes properly to see any type of obstruction, interference, or touches at third base. And then position here with our head and eyes, runner sliding at us, head and eyes between the runner and the fielder. Okay. Again, a really good look here. Remember, avoid going below third base. We want to make sure here that our head and eyes stay between the runners and the fielder as much as possible. Again, potentially too close here at third base, probably just a step back. But again, continue to work that space between the bag and the coach's box. That way you don't have to fight the coach to get the best look possible here as you adjust from point of base. Now, when is it okay to move below the bag? Again, just as we saw with the rundown, if this tag attempt is going to happen way in front of the base and potentially on the back side of the runner, which is kind of what we see here, we can move below the bag and kind of closer into fair territory because that's the only way we're going to be able to see that tag attempt happen on the backside of the runner. If you pick up this umpire U3 and you move him to point of base in this case, let's say we stay there, we have a greater likelihood of getting straight lined on this tag attempt. So really the only time it could probably be permissible for U3 to move below the base here is if that tag attempt is going to happen out in fair territory as we saw in the rundown and as we see here. We're going to move out so that we don't get straight lined. And again, we want to see the umpire adjust from point of base here to get the best look possible. And again, that's runner sliding at you and head and eyes in between the runner and the fielder. But again, because this tag happens out in front of the base, it's not necessarily going to be as easy to get head and eyes in between. DJ Seth, anything here on handling those things here before we move to back picks at third base and steal plays?
For that last play there, George just commented and just said, do we still want to stay out of fair territory there? And not necessarily. That's where if we're going to go below the bag, we don't necessarily have to use that line as like a boundary for us. We are definitely permissible to take a step or two in to be able to to see that in that position, there's a high probability that that umpire might have gotten straight line with the tag on the backside. So definitely, again, as Stu has been saying, start point of bag as your initial starting position, and then adjust with the play. And if that play takes you into fair territory, allow that to happen.
Yep. I would say, George, probably the probability of you moving into fair territory is very, very slim. The only thing that you're going to basically move into fair territory with, again, is if that fielder goes into fair territory and you're going to have a tag attempt kind of away from the base. So as DJ was mentioning, don't let that fence, don't let that that fair line, don't let that line kind of be an imaginary electric fence. You can cross that line if you need to. But again, if it's fielded and caught ahead of time, you're going to get that tag on the backside. That's when we can go into fair territory. But the greater percentage then is to obviously stay in foul and not get below the bag. That way you're not in the way. Let's say that ball skirted through and we round a base. That way you're not in the way there. But again, that is all based upon the read. Here we're talking about that's already been caught out in front of the base, so we don't necessarily have to worry about the ball skirting away. Good question. All right, last segment here then is handling steals and things like that at third base. Steals and back picks at third base. And again, getting a point of bag is step number one, and then adjusting with the play is from there. Now, just as we talked about with first base, us being able to get to the best position possible at third base for steal plays and back picks is dependent upon, number one, the depth of your pre-pitch initial starting position. So we don't want to be too deep, because obviously that's just the more distance that we're going to have to gain in order to get to third base. Secondly, remember that we always want to take a post-pitch step, at least one post-pitch read step, once the catcher receives the ball. That way our momentum is moving forward and allows us to go ahead and kind of get a step ahead, if you will, in a potential play at our base. And then lastly, realistically, it's our ability to read and anticipate and our athletic ability as well. So consider those things to be able to be in position. Remember, we want to not be so deep. Secondly, we want to make sure our post-pitch steps then are efficient. And lastly, we're going to go ahead and read it. Here's a steal play at third base. You see this umpire does a really good job here of getting some distance from point of base. Head and eyes in between the runner and the fielder, kind of getting as far as the play allows us to is where we see this umpire work. Great use of eyes here. Okay, the ball actually drops. And you can kind of see here, and clean up that safe call, obviously, but great use of eyes here. Gets the call right. Ball's on the ground. Again, a really good look here. Remember, depth of start, pre-pitch starting position allows you to get to where you need to be. Providing freedom of movement of the fielders is important too. From point of base, then we can kind of adjust with the play. Here we see this third baseman field it. Probably going to try and tag the runner at the infield side of the base. And he does his best as our U3 to get his head and eyes in between the runner here. And then if you kind of think about him being like below the base, he probably gets obstructed here or anything like that. And there's the ball popping out right there. You can kind of see it right on the foot of the runner, and our umpire is able to see it from there. DJ, I saw a couple things pop up in the chat. Anything to address here so far?
Just somebody had to leave. Keep going.
Okay. Yep. Gotcha. Again, we want to make sure we can avoid going below the bag at third base. Here's kind of why. This umpire kind of over pursues this one here. Remember, we want to get head and eyes in between the runner and the fielder as much as possible. The window is pretty tight at third base, especially on the 60-foot diamond. So again, adjust from point of base here as the play kind of develops and kind of avoid going below the bag, not only because you could potentially be in the way of the runner rounding the base, but realistically, angles then into the play can kind of be challenging too, and sometimes we have to look through the fielder. Nonetheless here, depth of pre-pitch starting position allows you to get to where you need to be. Remember, the post-pitch step allows you to get there too, and then just sheer anticipation is also very important as well. This umpire does do a really good job of proper use of eyes there for great timing. Again, great look here at another example of making sure that we have a great pre-pitch starting position. Post-pitch steps are there, but just kind of be careful going below the bag because if you go below the bag, as we see here, you kind of have to look through the fielder in this case. And again, point of bag or adjusting from there, probably one or two steps down is probably a little bit better of a position. That way we don't have to necessarily look through the fielder in this case here, as this umpire may have in the example. Again, so to kind of highlight here, number one, the umpire does a fantastic job of initial starting position that allows him to get there. Great anticipation, great post-pitch steps. Just be careful getting below the bag because your angles get a little bit tighter there here as the plays and things like that go ahead and evolve. A couple last minute points here for me to go ahead and wrap up with, and I already went ahead and showed you this slide, but kind of some big takeaways. First off and foremost here, remember, getting to point of bag, that's a victory in itself. So if you're somebody that's not comfortable with the wedge just yet, getting to point of bag is the first step. And certainly you're going to have some good looks at point of bag, but once you start to get yourself moving towards point of bag, eventually you're going to be able to apply the fundamentals of wedge positioning. And again, those are linked in the chat. And if you're somebody that's ready to go ahead and take those on, by all means, then here, the fundamentals of the wedge, go ahead and use those. Those are from Will Little and linked for you in the chat. And I've also got them, we'll have them in the description here on YouTube. But again, from point of base, remember, we're going to adjust as the tag play develops. So as the fielder or as the throw is coming in, we can adjust from point of base to, number one, get the runner sliding at us. Secondly, maintain our head in between the runner and the fielder. And then remember that bonus here. Yes, we're going to adjust with the fielder and things like that, but our timing comes from proper use of eyes. And again, all of this is dependent upon, number one, getting to point of base first, and then secondly, applying the fundamentals of the wedge once we get used and accustomed to getting to point of base primarily, and then applying the wedge as we adjust from point of base with the developing tag play. DJ Seth, anything else there to go ahead and add or anything at all there?
All good with me.
Nope, you got it all, Stu.
All right. A couple of quick announcements, and then we'll go ahead and hang around here. A couple of reminders and things like that as we get ready to go ahead and wrap things up. Then we'll hang around as normal. Last episode of the series is coming up to us next week. We'll take a look at U2 and break down U2. Now, we did a whole season on U2 back in the fall, kind of revisit some of those same concepts, talk about initial starting position here yet again. We'll also talk about dealing with steal plays, back picks, pivots, and things like that. So U2, I'll call him Twinkle Toes, I guess you could say, at second base. Him or her, we'll call him or her Twinkle Toes at second base. So U2's on tap for us next week. That's July 2nd at 12:30 p.m. And that'll go ahead and be the season finale for us here. And it will probably be the last episode for quite a while. Probably not until after Labor Day when we pick back up with many people going on vacation, working tournaments and things like that. So next week, the grand finale, I guess you could say, of all things 3 up, 3 down wise, not only for this season, but also in the future as well. Other than that, that is all I've got here. Again, appreciate everybody's attention and participation. We'll hang on here with some more Q&A and some more talk. But other than that, we'll see everybody then for next week in our final episode of the series, working as U2 in the 4-umpire system on the 60-foot diamond. Thanks for being here, and we look forward to seeing everybody next week.